So in this session, we have two presenters. The first one will be Gerry Stegmaier. Gerry is a partner in the digital health practice at the law firm Reed Smith, where he assists many of the world's fastest growing enterprises grapple with their most complex data and privacy-driven challenges. He's worked on the first iPhone, Amazon's Alexa before she had a name, and he has at one time or another represented nearly half of the public companies in Silicon Valley. He's also an investor, advisor, and founder in a number of health technology companies. So he'll be giving the first presentation on his perspectives on data access and data use in the context of COVID-19.
Glad, thank you so much. You know, there's an old saying, it takes two people to make a conspiracy. And it's been great to be a collaborator and conspirator of yours, co-conspirator, for almost 15 years, you know, working on some of the kinds of things that we were talking about. So I'm going to give a little background and then walk through sort of the talk today. But one of the things I really wanted to focus on for my purposes, and you should think of everything I talk about really through a very specific lens, which is the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence to data, period. And I viewed the COVID-19 pandemic as something that needed to very quickly be reframed psychologically, right? In other words, there was a period of time where we thought the risks to humanity could be almost imperceivable, very large, some parts, and yet we haven't responded as well as we would have liked. And I think I'm being really generous that way. And Clint said in the opening part of the session, we want to talk about not just descriptive data. And so my particular area of experience, on the one hand, I'm a lawyer by day in a digital health practice, helping tons of companies that we know. Many have been in this room. You know, I'm delighted to be here with DataVent, you know, Travis, the CEO, you know, with someone I worked with, you know, in his first company right out of college. So know them well, really a great group. But my impetus for being here today is as much coming from the entrepreneurial side, because the challenges we face, right, the future of humanity through the eyes of a realist, are not just legal challenges. And I was saying to Colette, I thought Alex's talk was really helpful, and I'll sort of reemphasize and tease out a few of his points. And then Colette really asked me to share stories with you, and I will share some stories about the stories. So these are real specific responses of watching how people have tried to come together to tackle the problems that we're facing, and really focusing on the issues. And ultimately, I hope we can see and talk about, you know, a path forward. And so with that, just a moment further about my sort of background and journey. It's a little bit unusual in that I trained in statistics and databases and data visualization almost against my will in graduate school. And then I went to law school as a lawyer who had a super keen interest in technology and intellectual property. And so I've had this sort of bizarre set of circumstances where the things that I have done accidentally have generally all been complementary and been very helpful. And one of the things that means is for what I'll call product-related problems, I tend to see beyond my lane. I'm really bad at a racy chart and staying in my lane. So I'm always looking for situations to step beyond that. So what does all that mean for where we are here, you know, now? Well, that means I might have a bit of a superhero complex. But I might not be the superhero that I think I am, and you might not perceive me that way. And I want you to sort of take that lens through the rest of the talk. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is why this problem matters, what are the things that are making it persist, some of the things we can do to ultimately sort of solve it, and then an idea, sort of a label, if you will, that I think relates to some of the things that we've heard. So Vance, next slide, please. So Captain America. Given all of our Canadian friends on, I thought this was a particularly accurate and useful metaphor for myopic Americans. You know, this version of Captain America is one who ultimately learned how to succeed by and as and being part of a team. And the hashtag many hands make light work is kind of a mantra for me. And one of the things that we saw, as problem solvers, and in particular in COVID-19, is as things materialize, I'm working with a number of companies seeking to essentially build the tools that make machine learning and artificial intelligence available to the masses, essentially democratizing technologies and tools and ultimately data that reside in the hands of very few. So if you think about how social media has enabled publishing, these companies want to do exactly the same thing for artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare, and especially around image data. And those are all really complicated problems. So about 20 months ago, I met with a bunch of globally leading scientists, technologists, for a weekend hackathon in Seattle. And we identified all of the obstacles to artificial intelligence and machine learning really blowing up in the way that the VCs and everyone else thought it would be huge. And I'll, 20 months ago, we were more optimistic about the pace of change than I am, today. And when the COVID pandemic came along, we asked ourselves if there is anything that could enable us to clear aside the red tape and the cultural barriers and the incentive challenges and all of the obstacles to enabling health-related data, treatment-related data, to be used for care and research related to care. Wouldn't this be the thing that would cause that to happen? And we could be, Captain America, all of us, those of us participating in this conference. Now, that's a really big, audacious sort of challenge, and people would have a lot of incentives, one would think, to collaborate. So what happened? Next slide, please, Vance. This is what happened. Chris Farley, the Hulk, right? The Hulk is big, he's bumbling, he has impulse control issues, and the Saturday Night Live version ultimately doesn't pan out as well as we would like. And yet we have this vision that artificial intelligence can transform healthcare. Well, why do we have this situation of the difference between the Hulk and Captain America? And what I want to suggest to you is that first and foremost, the single greatest obstacle to scaling artificial intelligence and machine learning is not technology. The technology, as Elon Musk has said, has grown at a rate that many people who aren't involved with it can't even fathom, right? Will we have general intelligence? I think that's optimistic. But where we are today versus where we were a year ago versus 10 years ago is almost a nonlinear growth rate in progression of what we're capable of doing and studying and learning. Now, what does that mean for healthcare? Well, what it has meant in the COVID pandemic is in order for those tools to work, they need data, and they don't need individual bits. They need terabytes. They need massive volumes of data. And we have some very good research, especially around health and image data, that tells us, and this is a fascinating thing, that the larger the data set is that we can get, the crappier that data set can be. Put another way, that the fidelity in the data need not be nearly as high, which means that if we have access to large data sets, the machines can effectively teach themselves. And I'm oversimplifying that a bit, but imagine then that you wanted to just find every chest CT that had been taken of someone who'd been hospitalized with anything pulmonary related, and you wanted to work backwards from that, especially if you could append onto the data prior chest images or research. You could do some really interesting research on that. And without even bounding what research is that you might want to do, if you could get such a data set and use it in a way that meets, privacy requirements, security requirements, accountability requirements, monetary royalty requirements, where they come in, I'm just listing these things, you might be able to do some really interesting work very quickly to save a lot of lives related to understanding COVID. So what happened? Well, folks that I work with have access to, leading radiologists, leading informaticists, leading policy folks, and the people who had the most data were too busy. They were focused on care. They were focused on finding bed space. And at the same time, ironically, vast sections of similarly situated experts were idle because they weren't in that particular frontline care center. It was incredibly frustrating. It reminded me of watching Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and seeing people at the Super Bowl begging for water, and a group of my partners in my law firm looked at one another and then we said, we can charter a plane full of water and have it there in an afternoon ourselves. And other people, in fact, did that and did similar kinds of activity. But that was that many hands making light work and having a situation where expediency allowed us to move forward. Now, what is the difference here for me for COVID-19 in our experience? What I saw with health image data in particular, and Jason and team can talk about other textual data, and don't get me wrong, we saw a lot of sharing, but effectively, for better or worse, treatment data in the United States is not interoperable, it's not accessible, and there are a number of barriers. Effectively, it's chained. So Vance, next slide. So this is the state of play from my perspective on the market, and I hesitate to call it a market, about where data is and data interoperability and patient-centric data interoperability. We are, make no mistake, developing the tools. We've built the technology, but we are far from achieving material improvements in healthcare and improving healthcare through data interoperability. And we are even further away when it comes to machine learning and artificial intelligence because of the volumes of data that are required. And I'm going to talk specifically about 3 categories of obstacles that I think we need to systematically address, not only for pandemic specifically, but in healthcare more generally. The first one, number 1, all of the law is built to dissuade, discourage, and not otherwise facilitate sharing of information, much of it bogged down by privacy concerns. There's a widely reported study, I think it was from McKinsey, that said we get $25 billion a year of deadweight loss, not because HIPAA is unenforced or there isn't any privacy law, but because it's complicated and figuring out what you can and cannot do and how to do that causes many organizations to not do it because their economic incentives for doing so are so minimal. And then the incentives that do exist with, it's like a Minions movie, right? I'll get out of my superhero metaphor, although maybe Minions are superheroes, is that many organizations and patients and stakeholders, whenever they hear the word data, they respond reflexively, mine. We have to stop that and get past that. And unfortunately, the law really lends itself to that mindset, not only in the U.S. to practices and many state laws, maybe more than half, depending on how you do the math and how you look at it, create property rights in patient records, in the practices, in the providers, which is part of why you have to have consent to give it to the payers. And yet patients have to have access to the rights because they have an interest. Very complicated. Second issue, and I'll just touch it, hit it, which is the infrastructure in healthcare is, in general, at least a decade and possibly 2 behind where other sectors are in terms of the ability to easily and meaningfully share and manage data. It's partially, because of legal complications, but it's also just because of the underlying, technology. Devices that were still running Windows XP, and that's not a slight to Windows XP, maybe it's a nod to it, remained in the field because the hardware in which they were built was intended to be purchased once, and yet the software underlying it may have been derogated and decommissioned. So much of the most forward-thinking technology work isn't necessarily automatically happening, at least in the U.S. within the healthcare system, because the technological infrastructure simply isn't there. And when some of the really large tech companies have sought to try and put their foot on the gas and accelerate that, we've seen a lot of bad press, and we've even seen providers and research centers who've worked with those folks get sued time and again, and have a lot of really negative press merely for working with these companies. And when you look under the hood, you see the agreements are good. And then lastly, and this I'll talk about more sort of structurally, or it's kind of a catch. Hey guys, can you hear me? All right. Yeah. Looks like got muted accidentally somehow. So this was, I'll recap where I was with the Batman slide. So it's many hands make light work. Batman and Robin need to work together, and the people in the foreground have a lot of incentive to preclude and prohibit Batman and Robin from becoming unchained. And so systemically, we need to figure out some ways to address that. And my view on this is I have some different ideas about some specific things, not only in the context of pandemics, also more broadly in the context of addressing those sort of three obstacles that I talked about. Colette and team, I just want to, because that audio got dropped, I don't want to go over lost ground, but some of that stuff was sort of an important setup for the next piece. How are we doing?
Time-wise, I think it's fine. We still have another.
Good. I'm not. It's not nonsense because you just looked at me smiling at the camera and my lips moving, but no one heard me for 3 minutes.
No. It was only for about 10 or 15 seconds that we lost you.
Super. Okay. Super. So, Vance, let's go to the next slide. All right. So, the question we have in the context of all this, right? We have legal obstacles, infrastructure obstacles, incentives obstacles. What are we going to do about this? What does it look like? How do we go from here to there? And from my perspective, one of the first things we need to do is really address legal considerations. And there is a paper, and this is sort of an example. It's a riddle for all of us. There's a fantastic paper. It was published by the RSNA, the Radiological Society of North America, and it was on ethical uses of data and image data for artificial intelligence. Now, I would share this paper with you immediately today because I think it's that groundbreaking, written by some Stanford radiologists, Kurt Langlotz and some other colleagues of his. I think we're more the primary authors. But here's the wrinkle, right? And I want to share this data with you. This really groundbreaking paper sits behind a paywall by the scientists and researchers who wrote it. I can probably get it moved beyond the paywall, but just sharing the idea about how we might rethink and reapproach sharing of information and why we might do that, I can't even share that with you. Now imagine if I wanted to share the data with you. So what does the paper say? I'll give you the thumbnail and why I found it to be so impressive. It has one insight that I think we need to take into account when we think about law and we think about those ownership and stakeholder issues writ large. The authors of that paper presuppose that most patients, when they receive care, don't care about owning their data, air quotes. The purpose for them interacting with the care and treatment process is quite simple. They want health care. They want their care to be delivered to them. And they don't necessarily care at all, nor perhaps as a matter of law should we permit them to limit the experience that the healthcare system gains from treating people. Now that might sound somewhat controversial, but I'm not suggesting that we compromise on privacy at all. But I am suggesting that the idea that when two people speak to one another, the person who spoke owns what the person who heard can learn and think about and derive from that experience is something that we really need to attack intellectually. And that's where this paper is really, really fantastic. And I think that if those providers and those physicians and those researchers are able to take this sort of simple insight, right? In other words, we don't, as Ben Franklin famously said, we don't need to kill 3 to keep a secret, or 1 and 2 don't have to be killed to keep 3 secrets. It's a bit, sort of mixed piece, but that's the first piece sort of on the law, is we need to attack how we think about privacy and how we think about ownership in the context of the greater social good, systematically and methodically. The second thing is on the infrastructure, and that really is about digital transformation. We've spent more than $35 billion subsidizing, a move from paper to electronic records. We have a patient-centered data interoperability rule coming up in the United States. But the byproduct of all of those incentives, if you dig into that rulemaking, is that we have structured and encouraged a technology infrastructure that doesn't lend itself to sharing and lends itself to people making, claims. And in the security world, we have a saying, if you put 50 locks on the door, it's going to be a pretty shitty door. And it's going to be an especially shitty door if you're on the wrong side of it and you have to go to the bathroom and the bathroom is on the other side. And yet our investments in electronic health records, subsidies, and government intervention, and how we've played and tinkered with the market to this day, have resulted in this patchwork that's fundamentally not interoperable, as Alex suggested. And we need to attack that both on a straight up business level in terms of digital transformation, cloud transformation, those kinds of things. But more broadly, if all the law were perfect, but the technological infrastructure isn't there, we're not going to get where we need to go as quickly as we can. So the last piece is in incentives. And I sort of have touched on this, but we need to essentially fundamentally work on realignment to enable sharing data. And then the last thing I want to share in this, how do we solve this problem? And then maybe we can take questions, or Colette can pose a few. And I have this idea for COVID-19 specifically, or what I call the concept of a strategic data reserve. And it's really modeled on, in the United States, what we have is called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But some features of this data reserve would be very, very different. Because I think if we could attack the legal structure and infrastructure challenges in a way where we just effectively enabled the plumbing to facilitate sharing when, if, and as we need to share, which isn't to say that we share automatically all the time, but the infrastructure is there, much like we've seen in some respects with the phone system, where people said, gosh, we can use the mobile phone environment, really neat, but how do we do this, right? The plumbing, as it were, to use location-generated, phone-generated data was already extant. But in the healthcare world, if the legal considerations, private considerations, all those things could be overcome, the technological infrastructure doesn't exist in that way for interoperability. So a strategic data reserve would essentially, move how we think, much like an interstate highway system for the 21st century, that says, gosh, these things are going to come up. How are we going to deal with them quickly? What are the tool sets? And then the last part of this outside of COVID-19, this is how I think about AI and machine learning, and I'm just going to throw out a couple of problems there. One is we really need tools that are distributed, that are virtual, that are fundamentally scalable in terms of compute, which are secure, have privacy by design, built in as a requirement from day one. In other words, we need people who care about privacy and understand what privacy is, working on the product teams to build the systems, because the systems will ultimately be better and they will be much easier to scale. And finally, addressing a lot of the law, infrastructure, and incentive issues, ultimately our accountability. When you talk to people in organizations about data governance, it's the quickest way to get a blank stare. And so that's all I really have. Vance, the last slide there. So I'm Gerry. There are my contact details if you want to reach out to me. If you want a link to the RSNA study in that paper, I'm happy to share it. And Colette, available for any questions, or sit in on Jason's talk till I have to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. I had a couple of questions just to follow up on some of the things that you covered. One was, for the current pandemic, is it too late? I mean, if the infrastructure is not there, and there really isn't time to build it, are we talking about putting something in place for the next time?
So I am incredibly optimistic. You know, we didn't have the bomb, and the Manhattan Project mobilized everybody's resources. So I'd actually suggest that I think we might be able to do this, but we never got to the level of urgency that ultimately required it, right? You know, we needed a MEAT Act to clear through red tape. And, you know, I can tell you some institutions that I know are very data rich, and this problem of data scarcity isn't something that they worry about or care about at all. In fact, the researchers who are there because they're data rich. And democratizing data isn't something that they see as a priority, because for them individually it's been solved. So I think we can accelerate this infrastructure, you know, challenge. But, you know, if I'm a betting person, if someone said it will take a year, I'd say 4. You know, probably 4, 5 times longer than, you know, your average conservative, you know, projection. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? Kennedy said, let's put a man on the moon in 10 years, and we did it. You know, but it took a lot of treasure and a lot of coordination and a lot of commitment, and it was a daunting vision. And right now, you know, the people that care about this vision are probably on this call.
And who do you think can lead this?
Frankly, if you look at what some folks have done around sort of space travel or electric cars or other kinds of folks, I think some people with very large fortunes who really believe in the prospects for AI and ML to benefit humanity, if it's done right, are the people that you know, we need to see get behind this. The folks at Y Combinator have some interesting initiatives with Sam Altman and some of the folks there, but you know, ultimately, I think it's going to have to be, you know, public-private, you know, collaboration. Because at the end of the day, each of us pays for healthcare, regardless of the payer system in a given country. Everyone is paying for healthcare one way or another. And so, if we want to realize those benefits, we have to tackle, you know, that third obstacle that I talked about for Janice England, which is what our incentives are for people to actually say, let's put a man on the moon, right? Let's unchain Batman.
Right. One last question, just to kind of expand from where you said to look at this internationally or globally. Do you see this as a global problem, or is it different in different jurisdictions? I mean, if you compare it to Europe or to Canada or to Asia, is it the same story everywhere, or do different places have different impediments to sharing data?
There are different tactical obstacles to getting the volumes of data, but for example, the National Health System, you know, in the UK, you know, has gotten a lot of scrutiny for pilots and sharing that they have undertaken, right? Certainly in China, in the PRC, it's much easier for them through, you know, a matter of gubernatorial fiat to say, hey, you know, we're going to sweep aside the legal issues, or even, you know, allocate the treasure to do that. But I think those, you know, core things, which are the legal obstacles, infrastructure obstacles, incentive obstacles, are resident, you know, regardless of geography, but how they manifest themselves as tactical obstacles is very, very different. And I'll give a simple pharma example. And we see a lot of pharma R&D happens in one country, and then the market for those drugs are ultimately other countries, because the process for R&D and approval, you know, really can vary. So I think the people that have enough resources will and are forum shopping, you know, forum selecting, especially for AI and ML. Where can I get the data, right?
That's so true. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you making the time today and sharing your experience and perspective. Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you. You know, if you can synthesize enough data, half this problem goes away, Colin.
Working on it. Thank you.
Thank you.